So there's two main components to what we do at Land to Market. There's certification services, which is really differentiating products, but there's this whole new realm of what's called impact accounting, and it's basically brands saying, hey, we want to measure what's happening along our value chains. We want to get good metrics to that, and then we're going to utilize that to create better loyalty with our customers. We talked about this a lot, I'm not remembering now, create better loyalty to our customers, to create better investor relationships. There's a really good article in the Wall Street Journal from last week called Grappling with Impact Accounting Math. And it's how the investor space is really saying, wow, for us to feel confident that you're doing more, this really needs to be like the disclosures you make as a public company. There needs to be more consistency here. There needs to be more oversight, more regulation. Regardless of where you stand on that politics, the world is moving in that direction. And now governments are standing alongside investors saying, yes, we want to be a part of that. Obviously, we've got COP26 coming up here in November, which is the bringing together of the parties to talk about how we're going to respond to climate change. The Paris talks were the last big one. This one is proving to be another one. So brands have been kind of put front and center as the ones that society is going to hang their hat on and say, okay, you're the ones that can send the signals back through the supply chain and create better impact than what we're getting today. How are you going to do that? And the brands are like, we don't know. You've got groups like Caring Group that looked at a lot of where their impact was. Caring Group is an apparel company that owns Gucci, Balenciaga, Saint Laurent, a number of luxury brands. They're partners of ours. And they did an analysis of where most of their impact happened, and they realized it happened at raw material sourcing, which is another way of saying farms. And they don't know anything about farming. And so the whole world is going, okay, how do we measure what happens on farms? So we developed EOV tool to look at the Ecological Outcome Verification tool or protocol to look at a broad suite of ecosystem services that's happening at the farm level. So when I first met Hugh, I think we had 5, maybe 4 brand partners. We called them angel philanthropy. So these were brands that were investing in our growth. There was no ROI for them, and there was a lot of bumps in the roads for us to figure out, but they basically provided us grants and said, go take this to the next level. What you at Savory has built in terms of a nodal and distributed system of hubs. The 50, 60 years you've been working with ranchers and farmers around the world, these hubs, and your focus on creating feedback loops for farmers is all something we're really interested in. And so we started with those few brands. That was in the early days. It was players like Epic Provisions, which has since been bought by General Mills, but it's like a meat snack stick company. If you look them up, they've got really incredible branding, and just started by the 2 most amazing and passionate founders ever. We worked early on with Applegate, which is a lunch meat and hot dog snack stick type company that's owned by Hormel. And in early days was Zook's Pet Food, which we've since poached the leader of that organization, and he now runs the program here at Land to Market with me and our growing team. His name is David Rizzo. I'm sure you'll see him in future webinars. But it was focused all on pet and how that could come to the table. And then Caring Group, who I already mentioned, that Gucci, Balenciaga, Saint Laurent, Alexander McQueen, all these luxury brands, they came on next. And as we started putting these brands in the same room, we realized there was an opportunity to talk about whole animal utility in ways we hadn't before. If you have meat, pet, and hides all in the same room, they're sourcing from the same farms, they're selling to the same consumers, but they're never talking to each other. And so we started building a lot of work around that, creating some really cool collaborative partnerships. And over the last 4 or 5 years, the program has really exploded. We had pretty steady growth year over year, doubling the number of farms that the number of brands that we had. Farms, we've now done our measurement protocol on 2 million acres around the globe. A lot of that growth is happening in New Zealand. It's one of our 4 or 5 hotbeds of the planet that are really embracing EOV and taking off in a big way, which is great. And then this last, I'd say 6-8 months, we've just exploded in brand membership growth, brands coming on board. And we're getting a new brand partner about every week. We just signed last week with New Balance, the footwear company. But global brands you guys would recognize. UGG is a big partner at this point, and their parent company Deckers. We've got who else on that list? That's Spot Farms and Pasture Bird. Pasture Bird's one of the largest pastured poultry operations. They're owned by Purdue Family Farms. It's a big entity. They're locally in New Zealand. Atkins Ranch has since come on. We've got Eileen Fisher, which is a natural fibers company that sells, finished goods. So they're in every Macy's and Nordstrom's here in the U.S., and then a lot of boutique shops. They do, sweaters and gloves and
so Chris,
a full apparel line.
So can we just dig into that a little bit? I mean, that's really interesting. So we're getting some of these major brands, and then a little bit later, I want to talk a little bit about how that can work regionally as well, and maybe think of an example about one of the Richard's grass-fed beef or one of those. But
totally,
what's driving those? So those big brands must be responding to what they see changing, and from a consumer point of view, because I mean, they're in business obviously, and they're going to be trying to align where consumers are going. You want to talk to us a little bit about what's happening in that consumer space and how that's kind of changed? And I mean, we tend to be a little bit divorced from that because of our export focus and the supply chain kind of, when we let that animal go, we kind of get it's gone, and we don't really get a good feel for what's going on in that marketplace.
Yeah, we see over and over again consumers really want to have their purchase have a positive environmental impact. And right now, there isn't anything that really speaks to that. So North Star that we come back to all the time is we want to be a voice for the land and the marketplace. That was the piece that was missing. If you look at all the other programs out there, from grass-fed to fair trade to GAP certified, they all have their little niche of what they do, but none of them are really speaking inherently to environmental outcomes. And the consumer has tried every way they can to bang on that drum and say, that's really important to us. And what they're giving back is just kind of like inferences. It's like, well, if we're doing these other good things, the environment's probably benefiting as well. We said we're actually going to go out and measure it. And so that takes us to the next level, to be able to have a quantification to that, to have that be our focus. And consumers are really responding to that. So, we're seeing in media all the time that consumers are going to continue to switch to brands and do more patronage to brands that are aligning with them on those shared values, that they're connecting with them. And so one of the major plays for brands that are getting this space is not only increasing margin, but really market share, to be able to go into the marketplace and say, we're going to sell more volume and we're going to build more loyalty with our consumers because we're connecting with them on the things that they hold most dear. So the challenge on that is consumers often know they want a positive environmental impact. They're very concerned about climate change. They don't often know all the buzzwords. You're not going to hear words like carbon sequestrations or ecosystem services or things like that. And so we have to help make those concepts more palatable, help them understand what we as growers and producers are doing, the values that we already have. One of the things that makes this a really cool program, and why we actually called it Land to Market, is that we find that farmers and consumers are both disenfranchised ends of the chain. Farmers, for all of history, have really been price takers. They've been just kind of whatever you get, whatever the oligarchy is going to supply you is kind of, take it or leave it. And the same has been true for consumers. They've been given very little information, the least amount of information possible to close a sale. And now this end is really saying, no, we want more information. We want more transparency, or we're going to go ultra local, grow our own. There's all sorts of alternatives. There's brands that are making that available to us. And so it's moving the whole world up. At the same time, the whole world is realizing the soil is the solution to some of our biggest problems that we're facing as a species. That really puts the farmer as the ambassador to that solution. And yet for all of human history, they've been largely relegated to the peasant class. And so there's this connection of shared values that's happening between grower and end user or consumer or customer, that they actually share a lot of the same values, and they've been very disenfranchised. And so our focus as Land to Market is how do we grow those two and put those two front and center as the critical component of what's going to drive society, the goals that we need to hit to be able to make it. But show that there's a connection between the values that they share, that actually both sides want the same things. And that kind of gets lost somewhere in the middle. The way you say, it's like, oh, we sell the animal and then we lose visibility of it. That happens everywhere. And so creating that traceability, that connection of values is really critical in the next phase.
Yeah, so just picking up, and we touched on this a little bit last time, was this whole issue of sort of localization, the impact that has on localization, local food production, and I guess that concept of well-being, regeneration, food security, etc. We just had a question from Mark in the Q&A around increasing the reach and how to, and movement around that. And I think you gave some example of this, someone on the West Coast who's bringing local production, then brings it in from has to bring it in from New Zealand to maintain that sort of throughput and the impact that has on the carbon cycle. But what's that also doing to local industries and the growth of the how do we use that land to market link to help grow that local and those opportunities as well?
I think local is going to be a huge part of this. I also don't think it's going to be the only part. So what I love about local is that you create that feedback loop, that pure democracy. The closer you can get the eater and the grower together, and when they can shake hands and stare each other in the eye, like there's real magic that happens there, and you're again creating that connection on those shared values. A lot of times in those scenarios, you don't need third-party verifiers in that, because it's people connecting relationally, and that's how communities were built. That's how culture is built. And so the localized aspect is what I've spent my whole career on, is developing localized supply chains that really allow and build up that connection. I think New Zealand and the trips that I've taken there, we've talked in the past, I don't know, I've been there 4, 5, 6 times, something like that. I think the opportunity in New Zealand is just off the charts. Of all the places I travel in the world, I think I love your guys' food culture the most. It's just, it's posh, it's upscale, it's diversified, but simple, and it's got a little bit of that like understated, Frenchness to it, of like, it's not trying to wow you off the plate with, lab-derived ingredients and foams a mile higher, Lemongrass was the big rage for a while. It's just,
we're still really heavily focused on that commodified kind of production and everything sort of fitting into a box, or it being driven by a supply chain, which is kind of, the old Ford model. You can have any color you like as long as it's black. So
it's black.
So how do we use the opportunities that are presented by land to market and EOV, those connections, to actually try and help us change those outcomes? And I guess, that's a pretty big mouthful in itself, I guess.
I think you're right there. I think there's, to pun intended, I think there's so much meat on that bone. The infrastructure is there. You've got a culture centered around, simple fare, and good quality ingredients. I think the opportunity to take that to the next level, and just like everywhere else in the world, align with those patrons on shared values, make the connections back to the farm. One of the things I love about New Zealand is everybody's a generation or two removed back from a farm. There's values there that are already baked in, and so creating that connection, I think, is really possible. And I think New Zealand, from me on the outside looking in, but seeing what I saw happen in California and Colorado, and then Europe and other parts of the world, I think that New Zealand is on the cusp of a local food explosion, and a whole culture of values that supports that. You see what like Slow Food and Terra Madre did. I think there's a lot that's going to happen in similar fronts to that in New Zealand, and that's not to discount that it's not already happening, but I think there's a huge amount that's going to go in that direction. I think the other. Go ahead, Hugh.
Yeah, no, you finish, and then we'll might look at the sort of market partner kind of structure that it can contribute to that. Yeah,
totally. I think the other side of that coin for New Zealand, though, is obviously export markets, and it's a huge part of your economy. And I think one of the challenges that we see that came out of the localized food movement globally is that it started to equate all miles to market as the same. And the reality is they aren't. The same as we have mass transits in cities, and everybody gets that. You guys are utilizing mass transit on boats to get products to market, often with a much lower carbon footprint than you have and inefficiencies of local markets. And so I think there's opportunity to differentiate what you're doing in the export space while also creating a really amazing local food scene that's aligned on those shared values. And I think New Zealand is probably better positioned than anyone else to really start to pull apart the nuance of what we get from local and what we get from global, and not have it distilled down to just that simple, somehow miles to market is the lowest common denominator, the only variable that we're going to look at, but looking at a broader suite of both values and impact that we're looking to support as customers.
We're getting a lot of tension at the moment in the New Zealand scene, really, from the New Zealand domestic consumers complaining that all of our pricing is dictated to by the export pricing. So I mean, effectively, all our good stuff goes for export, and the stuff, basically we end up sucking the whatever at the other end, because and the prices are determined by that. We're getting that in the timber industry, we're getting that across our food industry, and someone just brought up the point about cherries and some of those kind of things. So, but last week you also touched on this opportunity to actually start to add value to product and actually look at, consumers are now looking at different sort of buying habits around prepackaged foods, or again, so that concept of how do we still link that back to our EOV-based or our regeneratively sourced product, but in some different kind of form that brings or leaves more value back where we are, but also makes some of that product more affordable and more reachable by some of our consumers.
Totally. Yeah. And I think everybody walks that tightrope in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, New Zealand has some unique context to that. And you guys are better at getting pissed off than we are here in the US in terms of consumers demanding things and, farmers driving tractors to Jellie and things like that. We're not as good at organizing all of that. We have other issues. We're just trying to all figure out how to get along over here. But yeah, I think that one of the models we try to promote everywhere is that, sell local first. When you're going to sell global, try to value add it as much in that region as possible. I think that New Zealand has more opportunity than I've seen anywhere in the world. I mean, I know we're talking about food and fiber predominantly, but I look at lumber opportunities in the country, and you guys are planting trees like crazy. You got timber operations going up everywhere from incentives coming down from the capital. But yet everywhere we drive around, I see raw logs getting shipped off in boats to China. What would it look like to start? You're
really touching on a sore. We're going to talk about that again in a minute.
But what does it look like to start milling some of that more locally? And I think, the other one that I see in New Zealand, coming from California, which is the, often isn't known as this, but it's the top dairy state in the US. It took what wine it did, and then what chocolate did globally, but what wine did here in California, and said, we need to create a brand around the terroir of California cheeses and creating an artisanal cheese market. And I see some amazing work happening in dairy in New Zealand, and so much of it's getting powderized and shipped to Asia. And there isn't really a New Zealand cheese movement. All the cheese I've seen in the supermarket, not all, but so much of it is coming from other countries, and yet there's dairies 100 yards from the market. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, in New Zealand to do more value add locally. You've got all the infrastructure for it. You've got a stable economy for it. You've got the know-how and the gumption. I think there's and I'm seeing it from a lot of the groups there. We're talking to a lot of the big red meat groups. We're talking to some of the dairy groups. I think everybody's coming around to it, but it's time to just go out and do it. And so the more that can happen from when I think local sales first, and then local processing. The more that you can value add that and have it maintain that story and those values when you're shipping it out to somewhere further, whether that's 100 miles away shipping it further, or whether it's going on a boat and going across the ocean to somewhere. Keep those values and that story there.
Increasingly, with the work that we're trying to do, it's kind of trying to get the people around that concept of feed family and community first, and then think about what kind of comes from that and adding that value. And I think that increasingly that's growing in New Zealand. But you brought up some pretty sensitive issues in that last level. Which
look at me just throwing the pork chop in the synagogue.
pretty much. I mean, this timber thing. I mean, so at the moment, carbon farming is becoming the big issue. Carbon values are going up, and we're getting a situation in New Zealand now where basically we can't compete with carbon farming. I mean, and we've got government policy which is encouraging overseas investment into trees. The trees are owned by offshore organisations who are really just interested in price mechanisms. The prospect is that this productive land, or what some of our long-term productive lands going into tree planting, and we've got a housing boom in New Zealand. We can't get timber. I mean, it's all on the ports, and it's because we've got long-term contracts, and those contracts are influenced by other parties, and that's not dissimilar to some of our other supply chains. So I guess part of the issue when we look, again, from a holistic point of view, what are some of the root causes of that? And it's a big part of that, and this sort of sits within land to market, and something we touched a little bit on last week, is that how do we get better returns back to those farmers who ecologically are doing more good through carbon sequestration, water diversity, and the other ecosystems health that we're actually generating, so that they're better able to resist the temptation to just, talking to some guys yesterday, they're two-generation farmers in sort of mid-North Island, resisted for ages the concept of wanting to, selling up to trees, and have just done it. Because the money's just too good. And you get more productive land that's going to go, and it'll never come back to agricultural productive land. So, it's a really big issue for us at the moment in New Zealand. And
and I think that what you guys are facing on the tree front is probably further along in terms of unintended consequences of reductionist management than anywhere I've seen. I thought California was it, and then I saw what you guys are dealing with here in California. And at the top of the hour, as people were coming on, Hugh and I were talking about how we've gone through all these fires here in California. We lost our home 3 years ago, and have since had record-breaking fires all come, on the edge of our property. Be careful how excited you get about these forests. I guess that's a side note, but we went through a government program to replant the property that we have, and they wanted to plant something like 1,000 trees per acre. And it was like, what are you talking about? Like, and I said, shouldn't it be like 150 to 300 trees per acre? And then you do some thinning. And they said the old method was, you put 150 to 300 trees per acre. You come in 10 years, you do the thinning, the little trees, you get some core wood out of that can get sold. It still has marketability. And then you let the big ones get bigger, and you go in, 15 years later for your big harvest. But because the government has now decided that planting trees is all that's really needed to sequester carbon, they're saying, go ahead and plant 1,000 trees per acre, come in a year or two and thin 80% of it back out. And so, the reductionism there is like, if your metric is planting trees, yes, we planted a lot of trees. We're literally going to pay people to come back in 2 years and rip them all out. But it was just so that we could inflate our numbers of how many trees we planted. So I don't think it's exactly the same as what you're dealing with there, but I can empathize with the lunacy that's behind it. What you guys are facing in terms of forests that produce nothing for humanity, and certainly not for your local population. You're not feeding and clothing anybody, and having the opportunity and cost of that displaced farmers is like I said, like nothing I've ever seen before. It's a travesty, but it is the height of reductionism when you're looking at carbon as your only metric, and really only looking at above ground carbon, i.e. trees, as the only way to satisfy or check that box. We're doing a lot of work at Land to Market to disrupt that space, and I'm really hopeful that it will have a lot of impact in New Zealand, and that we can land this. But basically, what we're taking to the world is that carbon is a very tricky metric to measure below ground. I don't remember if we talked about last time, but
we touched on a little bit. But I think it's good to explore this, because we want to give these guys some hope that there's something coming down the pipeline that. Again, it's not all about carbon. Carbon's not necessarily a good indicator of ecological health. There's other things that we need to consider. And again, that kind of segues us into a little bit of a discussion about EOV, which I want to touch on. So.
Great. Yeah. So, I see forestry plantings a little bit like the bond markets, that like they're very linear. They're very predictable. It's like trees grow at this rate, they have this percentage of carbon, it's easy to measure, and it's why governments and other entities want to promote them, is because it's simple. I see below ground carbon sequestration, photosynthesis creating carbon in the soil, a lot like an economy. And so now, instead of like the bond market, we need tools like GDP to measure what's happening in the soil, that you've got photosynthesis happening, it's creating soil organic matter, that soil organic matter becomes the banks, if you will, for this currency, these carbon compounds to move around. When you have more soil organic matter in the soil, you have more surface area to hold on to more water. When you hold on to more water, the output of that is more biodiversity. There's different measurements that are all windows into the same room. So one, we're not even measuring carbon correctly in the soil. We're trying to take a very linear approach. I say we as society, we're trying to say, man, I hope this bond thing, this very linear, predictable thing will just translate to the soil. And it doesn't. It's a whole ecosystem. And an ecosystem that right now we're like, oh, there's volatility in that. It's probably a good thing. We need to be looking at the momentum of carbon the same way that we look at the momentum of money in markets.
It's a
and so
yeah,
it's a cycle. That's right. And so what are the other more established sciences that, as we're figuring that out, we can look at? Well, certainly hydrology and biodiversity and soil organic matter are other windows into that same room. They all have interrelation. So when we developed EOV, we intentionally wanted to look at an aggregate of ecosystem health that actually helps build a stronger carbon model at the same time, a soil-based carbon model that can get to a verified outcome without this more linear reductionist approach that we're seeing from everybody that's wanting to take the models that come out of forestry and plug it to the soil and go, oh, wait, it doesn't work. So in that same vein, we are now moving into a space that we're wanting to disrupt the carbon credit markets with what we call EOUs, ecological outcome units. That's basically a carbon credit that has water and biodiversity bundled with it. So since we're already going to the trouble to go to the farms, measure empirical outcomes, look at this slice or this aggregate of ecosystem health that's happening along the whole farm, why can't we create a token that puts those all together, when brands at the same time are realizing, oh shoot, they're going to hold us accountable for carbon. Well, now they're going to hold us accountable for water and wildlife at the same time. They're not making the connection that they're all interrelated. We are. So let's bring that all together. Let's sell it to them as a bundle. Even though those water markets and wildlife markets are more nascent than carbon, it actually comes as a more holistic whole, checks all the boxes for them. And it's more robust because it's how it all exists together in nature. They're not separate silos. They have interrelations. And so that's where we're moving now, is this ecosystem service credit space. It's kind of like beyond carbon or carbon plus. It has a carbon number with it, but those carbon models, they need more refinement. There needs to be more work done in academia to that. I think it's going to look a lot more like these models that look at whole economies, not just linear growth. And we make that more robust by bringing other data points or corollary data sets into that metric. So that's where we're going next. We've got some work happening behind the scenes with our scientists to create those ratios and those interrelations of how we put that together. And then we've got brands that are saying, hey, we're going to take our carbon offset money and we're actually going to pilot some of this with you guys so that we can get a broader metric of data while getting a stronger carbon or a more correlated carbon number at the same time. So that's where we're currently moving.
So Chris, that's awesome, because, again, part of, I know, you and I have talked about this a lot. I mean, one of the things that we're both passionate about is getting better returns back to our farmers somehow. We've got to enable land to support more families and support better economies. But one of the things that we don't really talk about much is the platform. So when we do the numbers of around the world now of land that's coming in under EOV, and we've got this database of information, which is now the biggest database of soil information globally, and so we talked a little bit before about policy. So it's about how do we, and that's one of the key differentiations for me around what EOV can represent, is that now, we've got all this information. We can now, one of the big things that we find in New Zealand is that, we can't use that information because it's from America or it's from whatever, and we're not getting the opportunity to make the policy changes or get that understanding that we can actually dig carbon in the soil these changes to ecosystems health that we can measure through diversity and water are actually going to show up beneficially in the long term, and we need to be looking at catchment and government level kind of support. That EOV database or that platform actually is going to be one of our best tools to help with that payment for ecosystems units and potentially help change that policy.
Yeah, we have a couldn't agree more. We have a platform in development right now to basically be the tech stack to provide everything we need in terms of registry, accounting. One of the biggest things we're going to face in this space, it's kind of the Wild West right now. One of the biggest issues we're going to face is a fear of double counting. Is that, are those units getting sold twice? So a lot of times, you know, when we're trying to attach what's happening from the farm level to, let's say, the meat, then a leather buyer comes in and they're like, oh, wait, we want that impact. And so we're realizing that impact is actually another commodity, and so it's separate from. Don't give the milk away for free. It's a separate thing. So when a brand comes in and wants to buy meat from you as an individual or from your collective, that's great if they want to capture some of that story. But the actual real robust empirical impact accounting data that goes with it, that should be sold as a separate thing. So that's where we're creating these tokens that becomes that separate unit. And that's how we're going to create new value streams for producers. That's the number one thing that drives me, gets me out of bed every day, you know, helps me work as hard as our team does, is we want farmers to get recognized for their role in society. And it really pisses us off that they've been pushed into this role of price takers. And you see what's happening to rural economies around the globe, and certainly New Zealand's no different, to where you've just got poverty coming into these places, and it's leading to poor choices. I remember the first time I went to Turkey, and we were talking to the farmers there that were old timers, really had a deep passion and understanding for the soil. And they said, you know, what do you want us to do? We have bills to pay. We know we're not farming well. We know we're not doing it right, but this is the only way that we can keep the farm alive in the way that the current system is set up. And stories like that break your heart. And I think that we are at an opportune time where, for the first time maybe ever, we can recognize farmers for their true benefit to society. And you're starting to see this realm of like rock star farmers becoming the heroes at brands of all shapes and sizes and media of all types around the globe. And I think this is our window to really step up and change the quality of life for farmers. And certainly getting paid for the positive benefits to land is one way of doing that. So yes, we're building a tech stack that supports all of that. That should be out next year is kind of the first phase. We've got, actually probably be end of Q4, early Q1. We'll kind of have the first pilot of that tech stack. We're working on the right brands to make that first purchase, to get that pull through going, and move that forward accordingly. So we'll not only have that market differentiation that's like, these are products that are grown right, but also have a whole new value stream of getting paid for doing things correctly. Most of that value stream right now, we're focusing on through brands in terms of buying offsets. Markets move faster than governments, so it's our primary focus. But right behind that will and is being governments. We've had conversations through Hugh in Wellington with top officials in the New Zealand government. Australia already recognizes EOV in their carbon program. We've got some big moves happening in South Africa right now. Had conversations last week in Costa Rica and Uruguay as well this year in terms of government supporting EOV. So what I would like to see is that brands buy offsets from farmers, and that governments structure more of their subsidies to farmers around ecosystem services. I don't see that as a double count. I would see it as two separate value streams with different benefits. The brands are offsetting what's happening in the rest of their value chain. They're using the biological portion of that value chain to offset what's happening in terms of packaging and logistics and all the rest. The governments, they're buying insurance for floods and fires predominantly. So they're buying insurance to say, we're going to make that soil more receptive to hold on to more moisture, to hold on to more life, to be more resilient systems. And then when we have these climatic disasters, we should have to pay less in recovery, because we don't want things that are like what's happening around the world with floods or fires out here in California or Turkey or Greece. We don't want those kinds of things here. So we're going to pay on the front end. And even 1% of what is currently paid out in damages or restitution after disasters, if 1% was paid in proactive mitigation, it would be a game changer for the world. And then the last sector, I think that comes up in that, it may actually come up more before governments, but it might be more in tandem, we'll see, is the reinsurance industry. So a lot of people don't realize most insurers have a secondary insurance on top of that. So when you have a big climactic disaster, all the individual patrons put their insurance claims into the insurance company. Well, that insurance company goes, oh no, this was basically like a run in the bank. Everybody's trying to get their payments paid out at the same time. We never expected something this big. So they turn an insurance claim to a reinsurer that then pays them to help cover those fees. So the reinsurers, the buck kind of stops with them. And the reinsurance industry is realizing in a big way, the same way the investment community is, that if we don't start solving global climate change and we don't start making that a soil-based solution and have transparency in our supply chains, none of this is going to work. And so those are the three bodies that I really see. I think that brands pay offsets, governments pay in subsidies, and reinsurers come to the table and incentivize this through their programs as well. That all becomes a whole new suite of value streams for farmers that didn't exist, 5 years ago.
I mean, that's some really exciting development. I guess just backing up the bus a little bit is one of the things we really haven't talked a little bit about is this whole, the big thing around EOV and land to market is the opportunity, is the integrity and the opportunity it gives the consumer about making choices that are going to contribute to those better outcomes. But so, everything behind the farm gate, effectively, or that value add behind the farm gate, sort of links back into the Ecological Outcome Verification program, which hand in glove fits in with the land to market program, which then provides that integrity through to the consumer. Do you want to talk a little bit about the market partners, how those market partners come on board, which can be from small producers right through to these multinational brands, and how how that potential flow through of revenues can end up back with that farmer and the benefits around the opportunities for premiums or payments for services and some of those other things that are starting to evolve out of that market structure.
Yeah. So just to start with, if you're newer to some of this, EOV is our intel inside. It's the scientific protocol that measures what happens at farm. Land to market takes that data and equates it to some sort of widget, to a actual something that the consumer is engaging with. So anything that's getting marketed off of that farm or going into a larger supply chain, that's where we start to equate the apple to the orange, because the ecosystem services happen at the farm level. They're not the cow, they're not the sheep. That's not the ecosystem services. So again, we started to pull those two apart when we saw things like, oh, a meat company is coming in to get all this impact data, but then there isn't any impact data left over for the leather company. We needed to really pull those two things apart. So EOV just measures farm health. Land to market measures or integrates that story with the products or services, even like agritourism, things like that the consumer is engaging with. So it's all the transactional side. So we make that connection from farm to the market. In terms of the brands and kind of where they connect, we tend to kind of divide it between big brands and small brands, and obviously there's a lot of blurriness, or there's a gradient to that. But big brands tend to be more focused on the impact accounting because they're at that upper echelons where if you're above $1 billion brand, you're hearing about this from your investors. Like, that's a big piece. You're hearing about it from your shareholders. If you're doing any sort of work with like IMF or World Bank, you're hearing about it from them. And so for them, compliance is a huge piece of that, of how do we start creating this impact data. It's why they all have 90-page reports that really just talk about the good stuff they're doing. There isn't any formality to how they do the accounting, but they're putting together lots of energy into creating some sort of report that it's like, no, we're doing a good job, because there's real benefits to them in the bigger kind of institutional play. Some of those big brands are also trying to work to connect that to end users, but they tend to be a little bit more risk averse on that. When you're $1 billion plus brand, what kind of claims you make to consumers, what questions does that open about your other product lines or your histories? Sometimes those bigger brands can be more risk averse on that front. Not all, but that's generalization that we operate in. The smaller to mid-sized brands are the ones that really we think are going to move the needle the fastest. They're the ones that they're usually doing it because it's core to their DNA. This is, the founders believe in this. They started the company around their business being a force for good, creating positive change in the world. They're the ones that align with consumers deeply on shared values. They build deep loyalty. They take market share away from big brands. They're the new evolution. The big ones are dinosaurs that are trying to figure out how to evolve into something else so they don't go extinct, which may happen. They may find a way to do that. The smaller brands, though, are really the new evolution, and they're the new species that's taking market share away from that old species. And so they're coming in and connecting with those consumers and building that connection. There's also some diversity on kind of reasons and value props per industry. So apparel typically has not connected with consumers on shared values. They've not figured that out. So in food, we often talk about, sponsorships are like NASCARing, like races. You got the race cars that are covered with all the different logos and things. In food packages, you see that all over the front. It's like people are making up logos to put on the front. They're making their own seals, because even though you hear about label fatigue or seal fatigue or certification fatigue, generally what you hear from the marketplace is if you have more seals and labels, the consumer doesn't always know what they mean, but it will equate to higher volume of sales and more premiums. And so the consumer is kind of starting to learn and grow into their own space of understanding of what do these things mean. More seals isn't necessarily a good thing, but what do they mean? Is there integrity behind it? And that's important. But that's kind of where the food space has been at. They just throw lots of labels, lots of claims at you. Apparel has been the opposite. They've been super understated. And so they're starting to say, okay, we want to align with consumers on shared values, but what does that even look like? We've never really put a claim on a hang tag before about where a product comes from, at the larger level. Boutique brands are doing that very well, but by and large, apparel as a whole hasn't quite figured that out. So they're starting to wrap their head around that. Luxury is probably the furthest behind on that, because everything about luxury is about being understated. And luxury is the one that has supported more animal-based products, particularly wool and leather, when others have moved away more to synthetics. And so trying to help them navigate that space is a huge part of what Land to Market does. How do we create that messaging that fits in with their understated marketing, but still has all the data behind it, all the robustness and integrity, and really starts to push them to dip their toe into that water, to get into that space. We're seeing a lot of retailers really drive the needle on that. So both in food, we've got major players and grocers like Amazon and Whole Foods that are really pushing for regenerative. Players like Costco, Kroger's, Sprouts, Thrive Market, all of them are saying they want to support regenerative. And now we're seeing that on apparel as well. Players like Neiman Marcus are starting to say, hey, we want to connect with consumers on these deeply held beliefs that they have. Right now, apparel isn't doing the best job of that. How do we start making that front and center, and how can we support that as a retailer? So it's exciting times. There's a lot of change happening right now. There's a lot of, they say right now that wealth is moving hands more than it ever has before in human history. The wealthiest 1% are dying off and they're leaving it to other people, some going back to philanthropy, not enough. But there's a huge change that's happening in the financial sectors right now. And we're seeing huge shifts on all fronts in just how business is done around the world. So there's a lot of opportunity to go out and stake your claim and say, this is how we want the world to be. And there's more malleability in that system than there has been in the past. And all the disruption from the pandemic is making it more malleable, not less. Even though it's disruptive for us as society, it means people are opening their minds to what's possible, and how they've done things in the past may not be how it works in the future. There's a lot of opportunity for us to go and create the change that we want to create right now.
Yeah, it sounds great. The momentum, it's amazing. And I guess part of my concern in some of that is, we when you think about that transaction that goes from sort of producer to the marketplace, is that generally if you're making a sale, you're doing that in response to a consumer need. Whereas what's sort of kind of happened in New Zealand is that we produce stuff in the expectation that someone's going to buy it. So we're in picking up on your comments earlier in this session, and also in the previous one, about our opportunities in the domestic space in New Zealand. So we're starting to talk to those small front, consumer-facing businesses, I guess, like retailers or restaurants or whatever, how do we help them in terms of their understanding, again, providing integrity into that marketplace, the support that Land to Market as a program would actually be providing them in terms of positioning and branding and some of those kind of things. How can that kind of shape up domestically for us? How do you see that potentially working?
Totally. Yeah, we work with brands on three pillars: supply, science, and story. So it's how do they find and identify the supply, whether that's local or global. But in this case, we'd be talking about local. So how do they make those connections and have it make sense for what they need for the whole year? So how are they, we all know that beef and lambs they have a seasonality, they have a window that makes sense for those regions. Luckily, places like New Zealand, you have a diverse array of eco regions. So it's like, oh, we're going to source from here this time of year and here this time of year, and always have, amazing top quality product that's coming out of the fields into their supply chain. So it's supply, it's science. How do we take what we're learning off the land, these empirical measurements that we're doing, and make that relevant to them and their key stakeholders? And then storytelling, how do we help them create the stickiness, the tangibility to what regenerative agriculture is and why it matters to their stakeholders? Like I said in the beginning, the consumers by and large ask for environmental impact around the world in consumer research over and over and over again. But when you ask them, even words like, soil health tends to test pretty high, but it's still, you start to lose them. Anytime you get any more technical, you start to lose them. So how do we communicate to them in a way that's authentic and not so watered down that it loses value, but actually create education opportunities to help the brand elevate the consumer's understanding at the same time and move them forward, is a huge part of what we do together with brands. So we create a lot of bespoke content with the brand. Like I said, I think New Zealand, as an island, I think you have a huge focus on export, but you have a huge focus on local first, because why pay to bring it in if you could make it yourselves? And so I've just personally fallen in love with that. It feels very similar to what I'm used to in California. We're surrounded by mountains. We have a very similar aspect of that. Of a lot of times they call it the Western Island, California. And I think the opportunity of what you could do there, as I just think your markets are getting so much more sophisticated than most of the world in terms of getting product to market, putting a nice face on it, having high quality goods, and selling it to locals. If you could add an added layer to that and you're supporting not only our own farming industry, but also at the same time, it's improving the environment at the same time, and we've got measurement that goes with that. I think that would land in a huge way with Kiwis. Maybe more so than maybe anywhere. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think New Zealand, like everywhere, is also on this kind of tipping point, this cusp that it very well could be a very exciting future. I know we're all kind of dancing on a knife edge right now with all the weirdness that's happening in the world, but I'm still super hopeful, and I think New Zealand can be a beacon of hope for that in the world.
Yeah, and that's great, thanks, Chris. And I guess just picking up on that a little bit is that's going to be our focus in creating that awareness around that land to market and what land to market is domestically. Land to market globally, even though you guys are based over there, I think it's good to emphasise the understanding that and the familiarity you've got and your team has got with the New Zealand scene, and probably just a good opportunity to talk about the other members of your team. I mean, we know a little bit about your own background, and we've got the little cottage prepared for Kelsey and Chris when and if they decide that they're going to do their shift to New Zealand. But Dave Rizzo obviously has got a high level of awareness about this whole concept from his own involvement from Zerks. Megan and Lisa, who now have become part of your team, are also very familiar with the New Zealand supply chain situation. Do you want to just touch on that for a couple of minutes, and then I've got a real curly from the Q&A that can probably start this whole seminar again. So
I love it. So like I said, I've made a lot of trips to New Zealand. My background is on localized supply chains, predominantly around meat, but some other ancillary goods too, some around wool. And I spent 15 plus years in California focused on that, and have made, like I said, like 4 to 6 trips to New Zealand in the last few years, was going about 2 to 3 times a year prior to the pandemic outbreak. David's background is in pet, has spent a ton of time in New Zealand himself. He's had co-manufacturers there in New Zealand for Zooks, and so has spent a lot of time on the ground. Megan's background is in apparel. She architected the supply chains for Eileen Fisher, which again, I said is like 85% of their materials are natural fiber. So they really focus on that. They've got like 40 SKUs and 80% of their wool is coming through the land to market program at Eileen Fisher. So she got that up off the ground, then went to work for Ralph Lauren. We did some cool work together with her at Ralph Lauren. And then she has since joined our team. So she's focusing on supply chain development. She spent a lot of time in Australia and New Zealand for obvious reasons, given that apparel background. And then Lisa is our director of marketing communications, has lived in both New Zealand and Australia, and worked for Global Animal Partnership for a bit, doing communications for them, and has worked for a number of red meat brands in New Zealand and Australia as a communications consultant, even since she's come back to the States, and just loves both countries. So she continues to get back to them pretty regularly again when travel is open. So everybody on the team has a broad understanding of New Zealand. We are looking to probably hire a couple of dozen people over the next year, and we'll continue to have focus on New Zealand. The top areas for us right now in terms of growth, New Zealand is probably number one. New Zealand and US are probably number one, but then after that, it's South Africa, it's Uruguay, it's Chile, and then Western Europe as a whole are the areas that are growing the fastest right now for EOV and land to market. So New Zealand's going to continue to be front and center for us as you guys are ready to move into more deeper policy discussions. We're happy to be there by your side and talk about how what we're doing globally can bring consistency to that. As you have evolved partners and progressive brands that want to come on board, both for local markets or export, we're happy to help support that and help move that along. Again, not to beat that dead horse, but I just think the potential for New Zealand is just really massive.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Chris. And yeah, it's the support of you guys that we get from you guys has just been amazing. And this constant reinforcement of just the enthusiasm that comes through and the passion that you all bring to it is just amazing. So we a really good comment and question from one of our audiences, so I'll read it out. It's great to see that even large national retailers are interested in regenerative food. However, this appears to be reductionist and cherry picking, as it doesn't touch on regenerative economics that must also be part of the puzzle for us to regenerate holistic well-being. So ideas for inviting for connecting this, some work around this kind of area.
Yeah, I think this could be a whole webinar, and certainly I I don't pretend to have all the answers on that front, but I've lived it front and center. I've tried to make a number of farms financially viable as running them, and I've been moderately successful at that. But you look at the opportunity cost of how hard farmers work, the level of risk that's against that work, and even what a successful one looks like, and it's pennies to what others are doing at the same level of risk and hard work in other sectors. And so that has to change. I think largely farmers have focused on premiums as the primary vehicle to get there. I think that premiums are fantastic, but just pure economics, I see them as a short-term stepping stone. I think we have to change things more systemically than that. If you look at premiums, they're designed to be high when there's a shortage or exclusivity of something in the market. As a program scales, those premiums drop off as time goes on. I think the best example you see of this is in organic dairy, to where at like 3% of the market, you hit a tipping point to where organic dairy, the premium doesn't, in most cases, cover the audit to do organic at that point. And so we based the whole notion of that business model on premiums, and at just 3% of the market, you're crossing those thresholds where it's no longer viable through supply and demand. And so I think premiums are great. I think you immediately get into this question of elitism that can, to the same end of the other end of the question about cherries, that can the average person afford these things, starts to become a bigger question. And so I think in that vein, is it right for farmers to not have a higher quality of life? And is it right to say that ultimately that buck should be passed on to the consumer, that they should pay the premium that goes back to the farmer, when both are the disenfranchised ends of the chain? And so while premiums can be a stepping stone and they can be a tool in the toolbox, I certainly don't see them as the only one. And so that's where we're moving towards this space of ecosystem service credits. I think the amount of money that's on the table for that is massive. I think the demand for that, and for those that know how to create true scientifically verified empirical outcomes, is going to be insane. The demand of people that are actually looking for that. We've got a farmer here, again, it's the Wild West, that here in the States sprinkled some stuff on their field. They put basically a probiotic. It was like a distilled compost. And Shopify paid $75,000 to that farmer as offsets. And there was no measurement or verification done. That kind of stuff is not going to last and be long-term. Having something, but it shows the appetite, it shows the demand that a brand was willing to pay that kind of money to a single entity. We can bring validity to that and a broader suite of ecosystem services to the table. I think there's that kind of money and then some for individual farmers on a year-over-year basis. And so there's a lot of price finding that needs to happen around carbon. Right now, it's selling at about $12 to $17 a ton, when it costs $300 to emit it, and the amount to clean it up is about 10x that, if you were going to try to bring it back through some sort of carbon capture technology. So I think there's a lot of price finding that needs to happen in that space, but I think it very well in our lifetime could be the primary commodity that we produce, and that we start to think of the animals as a co-product of what we're making. So I have a lot of hope in that side of it. But also I think as governments are wrestling with adding zeros to the amount they're spending on damage and cleanup after these disasters, you're going to see them come to the table in a big way. And particularly the more stable and wealthier ones that can afford to do so are going to change their subsidization policies in ways like we haven't seen in probably 100 years. So I see a big hope on that front as well. And then the other piece of what we try to do is through this whole animal utility is how can we create new value streams for products that currently are getting completely wasted, overlooked, or some other player, the abattoir sells it off as, rendering or something like that. How can we create those value streams to where farmers are getting paid for the organ meats, they're getting paid for the hides, they're getting paid for the bones, and these co-products or byproducts are not something that's just sold as like lowly garbage, but actually sought out after. And that's what we're seeing coming from pet and apparel right now, is they want to reach all the way back to the farm. They're partnering with meat companies, and they're creating, we had the first transaction that I know of ever in modern history where farms got paid for their hides rather than paying a disposal fee. They actually got paid for their hides through Timberland and some work that we did with them a couple of years ago. Timberland and VF Corp are members. And so we want to continue to expand on that work. But I think we've got to think beyond premiums and new value streams and making the farm more resilient as a whole, not just premiums alone.
That's some great words, Chris, and some great insight into where we're trying to go with this. And because we're keen to sort of tap into those opportunities through maybe just get some of this flow working from a New Zealand point of view and create some of that awareness. And I guess also, part of that holistic point of view is that where do we, what's that abundance that we can kind of see, but where are we going to make the most impact when we start moving there, we can actually start to get that thing rolling. So many things that we want to touch on. I mean, this is, keen to talk about this whole concept of VOV being agnostic and how that actually is sharp and have influence in some of these catchment levels kind of management. That's also starting to show up with some of these guys that are that I know you're working with them up in the US. But yeah, we'll leave
a short and spicy answer to that no one at EOV or Land to Market is going to tell you how to farm. It's measuring outcome.
And I think that's a really good point. We just got another comment that we get top of the hour, but I really like the idea that brands pay offset and government pays subsidies. What are the arguments for the latter beyond the positive environmental impact, demand from public willingness to pay the consumer for public goods. Consumer willing to pay for public goods. So I think we've touched on a number of those kind of things, but there's a whole area of discussion that we can sort of go into there. But we're out of time. We're beyond the top of the hour. We've probably pushed Chris beyond his level of enthusiasm. I know he's working pretty hard and
can't be done.
That's true. I've learned that. But yeah, and just look, it's always great to connect and just get some insight into what to where this whole thing is going, the opportunities that can present. I still see land and market, EOV, that combination of things as where we can actually look at making some real change in New Zealand, and just great to hear where you're going with that. So thanks again for your time, and thanks to everyone for coming on board, and we'll just keep trying to dig into the space a little bit more and help people's level of understanding. Thanks, Chris, and you.